Miles Corbett was supposed to be halfway back to Crosswind Ranch before dark. Instead, the 6'7" cowboy stood in a hotel kitchen, cinnamon and hot bread in the air, refusing to leave until someone answered one question. Who cooked this? Behind the swinging door, Florence Whitcomb froze with a flour-covered towel in her hands. For years, people had eaten her food without caring who made it. Now the biggest cowboy in Millstone had pulled out a chair, and he wasn't going anywhere. Why had one bite made him stay? Stay with Florence's story, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. By 5 o'clock that October evening, the windows of Millstone's town hall had gone gold with lamplight. Outside, the wind came down from the Lost River Range with the first real bite of winter in it, lifting dust from Main Street and rattling the hitching rails in front of the mercantile. Inside, nearly 60 cattlemen, wives, merchants, teamsters, and ranch hands crowded around long plank tables, dressed with white cloths borrowed from the church. They could smell the supper before they saw it. Roast beef browned dark at the edges, potatoes with onion and drippings, green beans cooked with salt pork, yeast rolls brushed with butter, apple pudding with cinnamon. Most of it had been made by Florence Whitcomb. Almost no one in the dining room knew that. She stood in the rear kitchen with her sleeves rolled above her elbows, one hand steadying a roasting pan, while the other worked a long-handled spoon through gravy darkened with pan juices. Heat from the cast-iron range had turned the little room close and damp. A strand of brown hair had escaped the pins at the back of her head and stuck to one cheek. Florence ignored it. She had been cooking since before daylight. 2 hotel girls carried platters through the swinging service door. Mrs. Larkin from the church committee arranged rolls in linen-lined baskets. Gordon Talbot, proprietor of the Grand Union Hotel, moved between the kitchen and hall in a black coat that never seemed to collect flour, no matter how close he stood to it. "Another roast," he said. Florence already had it ready. She lifted the heavy pan from the warming shelf. One of the hotel girls reached for it, hesitated at the weight, and Florence shifted her grip. "I'll take it to the door." She carried it across the kitchen. The girl's eyes dropped briefly to Florence's broad waist beneath her plain gray dress, then moved away. Florence noticed. She always noticed. She simply no longer gave people the satisfaction of seeing that she had. At 33, she knew how much room her body occupied. Other people had spent enough years reminding her. She also knew exactly how much flour 18 dozen rolls required, how long a beef roast could rest without cooling, and how to rescue gravy when a distracted helper had added too much salt. One of those things mattered tonight. She had decided it would be the latter. The service door swung open. Noise rushed in. A man somewhere in the hall called, "Talbot, whoever cooked this beef deserves a raise." Laughter followed. Gordon stepped through with the platter. "Glad you approve," he called back. Florence remained on the kitchen side of the doorway. A moment later, a woman said, "And these rolls?" "Mercy." "Gordon, where have you been hiding this cook?" Florence's hand stopped on the spoon. "Only for a second." Gordon laughed. It was the easy laugh he used with paying guests. Some people are better kept where the work is done. Another little ripple of laughter. Not cruel enough for anyone to be ashamed of. That was usually how it worked. Florence wiped the spoon against the rim of the pot. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and went back to the stove. No one came into the kitchen to see her face. That suited everyone. The supper moved on. Plates came back scraped clean. More rolls went out. The apple pudding disappeared faster than Gordon had expected, and he sent a boy twice to ask if there was another pan. There was. Florence had made one extra because Gordon always underestimated dessert. By 7:30, chairs were beginning to scrape back from the tables. Men drew on coats and discussed calves, freight rates, early snow, and whether Crowfoot Pass would stay open through November. Florence began stacking pans. Her feet ached. Her shoulders ached. She had eaten half a heel of bread standing beside the stove around noon, and nothing since. She was washing a carving knife when the service door opened again. Not swung. Opened. Slowly. A man ducked beneath the frame. Florence looked up. He was so tall that for one absurd moment she thought the doorway itself had been built wrong. Then he straightened as much as the low ceiling allowed. He wore a dark wool coat dusted lightly at the shoulders from the road, and a weathered hat he had already removed. His hair was brown with gray at the temples. His face had the hard, quiet lines of someone accustomed to sun, cold, and long distances. Florence knew who he was before Gordon said the name. Everybody in Millstone knew Miles Corbett by sight. Crosswind Ranch, 12 miles northwest. A man roughly 6 feet 7 inches tall did not pass unnoticed in a town where half the doorframes had been built by men barely clearing 5'10". Miles looked around the kitchen. Not quickly. His eyes moved over the cooling pans, the flour board, the racks of bread, the kettle steaming near the stove. Then they came to Florence. Gordon appeared behind him. "Mr. Corbett? Didn't realize you were still here." Miles turned slightly. "Who cooked the supper?" Gordon smiled. "My hotel supplied the kitchen. That wasn't what I asked." The smile shifted. Florence lowered the carving knife into the wash water. Gordon gestured toward the dining room. Mrs. Larkin helped organize things. The church ladies did their share. Miles looked through the doorway toward the hall, then back to Gordon. "Who cooked it?" Gordon's mouth tightened. Florence watched the exchange in silence. Men did not usually press Gordon Talbot once he had decided a conversation was finished. Miles apparently had not been informed of that rule. He stepped toward the side table where one last roll remained on a chipped white plate. "May I?" The question was directed at Florence. She blinked. "Yes." He picked up the roll. It had gone lukewarm. He tore it open. Steam no longer rose from the center, but the crumb was still soft. He tasted it, chewed. Florence had watched hundreds of people eat food she had cooked. She knew the usual reactions: pleasant surprise, indifference, polite approval. Miles simply stood there. Then he took another bite. "Butter in the dough?" "Some." "Honey?" "A little." "Potato water?" Florence looked at him properly then. "Yes." Something shifted at one corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Thought so." Gordon cleared his throat. "Florence handles most of the kitchen work." Miles turned his head. "Florence." "Whitcomb," she said. "Florence Whitcomb." His gaze came back to her. Direct. No quick downward inspection. No poorly hidden calculation. Just attention. "You made the roast?" "Yes." "The pudding?" "Yes." "The beans?" Mrs. Larkin snapped them. "I cooked them." "And the rolls?" "I did." Miles set the remaining half of the roll on the plate. "Best meal I've had since spring." Florence looked down at the dishwater, because for some reason that simple sentence was harder to receive than open mockery. Behind Miles, Gordon gave a small laugh. "She's dependable in a kitchen." Miles did not turn. "I wasn't asking you." The room went still. Even the hotel girl near the pantry stopped folding towels. Florence lifted her eyes again. Miles rested both hands lightly on the back of a wooden chair. "I've got 18 men at Crosswind. More when we're moving cattle. Cook I had went to Boise after his brother broke a leg, and the man filling in now can burn coffee in a tin pot." Florence said nothing. He continued. "I need someone through winter preparations. 6 weeks to start." Gordon stepped forward. Mr. Corbett? Florence is employed through the hotel. No, Florence said. Both men looked at her. She dried her hands. Not anymore. Gordon's jaw tightened. The hotel had stopped scheduling her for regular work 3 weeks earlier, though he still called when a supper needed cooking and paid her by the day. Neither of them said that aloud. Miles studied her for a moment. Then he pulled the chair away from the wall. I'd like to talk terms. Florence looked toward the dining room. Most of the guests had gone. Beyond the windows, the last gray light was draining from Millstone. The road to Crosswind climbed toward colder country, and anyone with sense would have been halfway there already. She looked back at Miles. You'll lose daylight. I know. Crowfoot Road gets bad after dark. I know that too. He turned the chair around and sat. Even seated, he seemed too large for the little kitchen. Gordon stared at him. Florence stared too. Miles removed his gloves 1 finger at a time, set them beside his hat, and folded his hands on the scarred kitchen table. He had meant to ride 12 miles before nightfall. Instead, the giant cowboy looked at Florence Whitcomb as though there was nowhere else he needed to be. I'm listening, he said. Florence remained standing on the other side of the scarred kitchen table. Gordon Talbot had not left. She could feel him near the doorway, stiff with irritation, but for once she did not turn to see whether he approved of what she was about to say. 6 weeks, Florence said. Miles nodded once. Through winter cattle preparations. 6 weeks, she repeated. And the wages written down before I go anywhere. That got Gordon's attention. Florence, really? She ignored him. Miles reached inside his coat and took out a small leather notebook. He laid it beside his gloves. Fair enough. Florence watched him. I want my own room. You'll have one. With a door. Miles's eyes rested on her face for a moment longer than before. With a door. And a lock. Another nod. The room at the east end of the house has one. Florence had expected resistance by now. Men usually started resisting when a woman moved past gratitude and into terms. Miles simply waited. She folded her hands at her waist. The kitchen is mine while I'm working there. Gordon made a sound behind her. Miles said, Explain. If I'm responsible for feeding 18 men, I decide how the pantry is arranged. I decide what gets ordered. I decide when the kitchen closes. If a ranch hand takes food without asking and leaves me short for supper, that becomes his problem before it becomes mine. Something almost moved at the corner of Miles's mouth. Anything else? Florence hesitated. This was the part people misunderstood. I am not coming there as a maid. Miles's expression did not change. I don't expect you to. I won't scrub bedrooms. I won't wash personal clothes. I won't be told that because I'm a woman under the same roof I ought to make myself useful everywhere else. I hired you for the kitchen. You haven't hired me yet. That time he did smile. Only a little. No, he said. I suppose I haven't. He opened the notebook. 6 weeks. $30, room and board included. Florence blinked. Gordon shifted sharply. That's excessive. Miles turned his head. I don't remember asking you what Crosswind can afford. Gordon's face hardened. Florence looked down at the notebook. $30. It was more than Gordon had paid her for 2 months of irregular kitchen work. 25, she said. Miles looked up. Gordon stared at her as if she had lost her mind. Florence continued. 30 makes it sound like you're buying trouble before you know whether I can do the work. I ate the supper, one supper. I've hired men on less evidence. 25, she said again. If you think I'm worth more at the end of 6 weeks, we can discuss it. Miles studied her. Then he took a pencil from the notebook's spine. 25. He wrote carefully. October 18th, 1888. Florence Whitcomb. 6 weeks. Kitchen authority. Private room. Board. $25. He tore the page free and slid it across the table. That plain enough? Florence read every line. Twice. Then she folded the paper once and put it into the pocket sewn inside her dress. Plain enough. Miles stood. The low ceiling made him bow his head again. I'll send a wagon tomorrow. I can bring myself. I expect you can. Their eyes met. Neither looked away immediately. Then Miles pulled on his gloves. Crosswind Road turns north at the old lime kiln. Stay left after the second creek crossing. The right fork goes toward Crowfoot Pass. I know the road. I figured you might. He put on his hat. Gordon waited until the outside door shut behind him. Then he turned on Florence. Do you have any idea what people will say? Florence picked up the dish towel. They've always found something. You'll be the only woman living at a ranch full of men. I'll be a cook living in a room with a lock. That isn't how Millstone will tell it. She looked at him. For years, she had measured her words around Gordon Talbot, because he controlled whether she worked and when. Now the words came easily. Then Millstone can improve its storytelling. She turned back to the dishes. By sunrise the next morning, Florence's trunk was tied beneath a canvas sheet in the back of a hired wagon. She owned less than the trunk suggested. 3 work dresses, 1 church dress, 2 aprons, a wool shawl. Boots resoled the previous spring. Her recipe book. A narrow tin box containing receipts, letters, and $17 she had not touched since leaving the Grand Union. She carried the written agreement in her dress pocket. Millstone disappeared behind her as the wagon climbed northwest. The Lost River Range stood pale against the morning sky, the upper ridges already holding snow. Cottonwoods along the creek had gone nearly bare. Beyond them stretched open country broken by sage, fences, and long brown fields left to winter. The driver left her at the Crosswind gate shortly before noon. Miles was there, not waiting theatrically. He had a hammer in one hand and was resetting the lower hinge on the gate. He straightened when the wagon stopped. Mrs. Whitcomb. Miss. He paused. Miss Whitcomb. Florence climbed down before he could offer his hand. Miles noticed. He did not offer it afterward. Instead, he lifted her trunk from the wagon as if it contained bedding rather than half her life. The main house sat on a low rise beneath the mountain slope. 2 stories, broad porch, smoke coming steadily from the kitchen chimney. Barns and corrals spread behind it, with men moving between them and horses tied along a rail darkened by years of rains. A man with a gray mustache came from the barn. Russell Kane, Miles said. Foreman. Russell tipped his hat. His eyes moved once over Florence, quick but unmistakable. Florence recognized the assessment. She let him finish it. Miles says you're taking over the kitchen. For 6 weeks. Russell glanced at Miles. Miles set Florence's trunk on the porch. Anyone walks into her kitchen, she outranks him. Russell raised one eyebrow. That include you? Miles looked toward the house. Especially me, apparently. Florence almost smiled. The kitchen prevented it. She stopped in the doorway. A cracked crock sat beside the stove. Grease had darkened the wall behind the range. Flour was stored in an open sack near the wood box. A side of bacon hung too close to the chimney heat. One skillet had been left with burned beans hardened across the bottom. Florence took off her shawl. Who has been cooking? Russell cleared his throat. Mostly Billy Trent. Does Billy hate you all? Russell coughed into his fist. Behind her, Miles made a sound that might have been a laugh. Florence rolled up her sleeves. I want every food sack brought in from the store shed. Russell looked toward Miles. Miles said nothing. Florence turned. Mr. Kane. Russell looked back at her. Every sack, every jar, every crock. I need to know what I have before somebody asks me to make supper from it. Russell nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. Within an hour, the kitchen floor was lined with provisions. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, coffee, molasses, 2 crates of winter apples, onions beginning to soften, a barrel of potatoes that should have been moved days ago. Florence worked through all of it. By 4 in the afternoon, she had thrown out what could not be saved, moved the potatoes, covered the flour, scrubbed the main preparation table, and started stew in the largest pot she could find. Men began drifting in at dusk. 18 of them, though never all at once. They entered loud, hungry, and dirty from work. The first one through was a narrow man with red hair who stopped when he saw Florence. You the new cook? I am. He glanced into the pot. What is it? Supper. A few men laughed behind him. The red-haired cowboy sat. When Florence set out bread, stew, and fried potatoes, conversation dropped by half. The man took one bite, then another. He reached for a second biscuit. Florence kept wiping the counter. He took a third. Miles stood near the doorway with his coffee mug in one hand. He watched the biscuit disappear. Then he looked at Florence. Looks like I hired the right person. She met his eyes. Ask me in 6 weeks. The men laughed. Even Russell. Later, after the table had emptied and the lamps were burning low, Florence returned to the pantry with her notebook. She counted again. Flour, coffee, beans, salt, sugar. She checked the storage shelves, then checked them once more. The numbers did not improve. Miles appeared in the doorway. You've got that look. What look? The one people get when something costs more than they expected. Florence closed the notebook. How much food were you expecting before winter? 2 freight loads. When? First one should have been here 4 days ago. Florence looked toward the pantry shelves. And the second? Next week. She opened the notebook again. Her finger moved slowly down the column of figures. Outside, wind pushed against the north wall. Somewhere near the barn, a loose length of chain knocked once against a post. Florence looked up at Miles. If that first load doesn't arrive soon, 18 men are going to eat through what you've got faster than you think. Miles's face settled. How fast? Florence looked at the shelves one more time. Fast enough that 6 weeks may be the least of our problems. Miles did not answer immediately. He stepped into the pantry, though there was barely room for him between the flour barrel and the hanging shelves. He lowered his head to miss the beam, then looked at the rows Florence had arranged. What do you need first? Flour, coffee, salt, beans. Sugar if you want anything decent through winter. Anything else? Time. He nodded. I can get most things. Florence closed the notebook. Not if the road closes. That was the first real conversation they had about winter. After that, the days began finding their own shape. Florence rose before 5. She dressed by lamplight in her small east room, pinned her hair, tied on an apron, then walked the quiet hall to the kitchen while frost silvered the porch boards outside. By the time the first hand came in, coffee was hot. By the time the second came in, breakfast was ready, The men learned quickly that she meant what she said about the kitchen. No reaching into the pantry, no knives left dirty, no taking supper before everyone came in unless she knew why. At first, they tested the rules the way men test a new gate. Not hard, just enough to see whether it would hold. It held. Florence did not shout. She did not need to. When one hand walked off with half a loaf meant for supper, she simply served him less bread at noon and told him why. He never did it again. Russell noticed. So did Miles. The ranch changed in small ways. Men started arriving on time for meals. Coffee stopped disappearing by mid-morning because Florence rationed the grounds properly. She kept a jar of soft biscuits near the stove for men coming in with bad teeth. When Russell bruised 2 fingers under a gate hinge, she cut his meat smaller without saying anything. He looked at the plate, then at her. She was already carrying stew to the other end of the table. One evening, a week into November, Jerome Hale lingered after supper. He was the youngest man at Crosswind, 23, with long arms and a habit of twisting his coffee mug by the handle when he was trying to decide whether to speak. Florence was wiping the table. Jerome said, "Miss Whitcomb?" She looked up. "Yes? You ever make pudding?" "I've made several." He thought about that. "Molasses kind?" "Probably. My ma used to make one around this time every year." Florence set down the cloth. "What was in it?" Jerome shrugged. "Molasses. Cinnamon, maybe. Raisins sometimes." "Was it steamed or baked?" He stared at her. "I don't know, Soft?" "Yes." "Dark?" "Very." "Any cloves?" He closed his eyes briefly. "Yeah, I think so." Florence nodded. "Anything else?" Jerome looked down at the mug. She put something sharp in it. "Not much." "Apple vinegar?" His head came up. "Maybe." Florence picked up the cloth again. "All right." Jerome waited. "For what?" "I heard you." He looked as if he wanted to say something else, then thought better of it and left. 2 mornings later, there was dark molasses pudding beside the oatmeal. Jerome sat down without noticing. Then he saw it. He cut one piece, took a bite, stopped chewing. Across the table, one of the men started to say something. Russell gave him a look, and the words died before they came out. Jerome swallowed. He put his spoon down. Then he turned his face toward the window and stared at the frost gathered along the glass. Florence kept working at the stove. A minute later, Jerome picked up the spoon again. He ate the rest slowly. Nothing was said. That afternoon, Florence found a new stack of split kindling beside the kitchen door. Jerome did not mention it. Neither did she. By the 3rd week, Miles had developed a habit of coming in after supper, always for some reason. Coffee, a ledger, a question about provisions, a request for bread to take on the north fence line. Florence noticed that the reasons became thinner as the days passed. She did not point that out. One night he came in carrying a torn glove. "Do you sew?" "Enough." He set it on the table. She looked at the split seam. "You've got 18 men and none of them can sew?" "Apparently not." "You can." He looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because anyone who owns a ranch 12 miles from town and can't sew one glove is either foolish or spoiled." Miles leaned one hip against the table. "Which do you think I am?" Florence threaded a needle. "I haven't decided." That earned the rare half-smile. She repaired the seam. He watched her hands, not staring, just quiet attention. When she finished, she handed the glove back. "Try not to tear it again. No promises." The weather worsened. Snow came thin at first, then stayed. The upper ridges disappeared behind gray cloud. The road to Millstone remained open, but only barely. Florence kept counting stores. Every time she did, the numbers bothered her. The freight still had not come. Miles sent a rider into town twice. Both times the answer was the same. Delayed. Bad road. Teams backed up. Florence wrote every date in her notebook. She did not say why. Then, near the end of November, 3 yearlings broke through a weak section of the north fence during a hard freeze. Miles and 2 hands rode out before noon. By dark, the hands had returned. Miles had not. Florence asked Russell once, "Where is he?" "Still looking." "Alone?" "He knows that country." Florence said nothing. She put supper on the table. The men ate. She cleared the plates. 9 o'clock came. Then 10. The wind scraped dry snow against the windows. Florence washed the last pan. Russell came in once, looked toward the road, then left again. At 10:30, Florence put a plate near the stove. Beef, potatoes, 2 biscuits. She covered it with another tin plate. Russell saw. He did not comment. It was close to midnight when hooves finally came into the yard. Florence heard them before anyone called out. She opened the kitchen door. Cold air came in hard. Miles crossed the yard with snow on his shoulders and ice caught in the hair near his temples. He was leading one tired horse and cursing another under his breath. Florence stepped back from the doorway. He came inside. "Find them?" "2. "And the third?" "Found tracks heading east." "Russell can take men in daylight." He took off his gloves. His fingers were stiff from cold. Florence moved the covered plate from the stove to the table. Miles looked at it, then at her. "You kept supper. Sit down." He sat. She poured coffee. He wrapped both hands around the mug before lifting it. For a while, the kitchen held only the small sounds of a late-night room. Fire settling in the stove, wind against the eaves, a fork touching tin. Florence went back to kneading dough for morning bread. Miles ate slowly. Halfway through the meal, he said, "You didn't need to wait." "I didn't." His fork stopped. Florence kept working. Miles looked toward the covered bread bowl. "Then why is this still warm?" She pressed the dough once, folded it, pressed again. "Because you weren't home." Silence. Florence realized what she had said only after the words were already in the room. Her hands slowed. Miles did not move. She reached for flour that was not needed. Behind her, very quietly, he said the word. "Home." Florence did not turn. Outside, the wind kept moving down from the mountains. Inside, Miles finished the plate she had kept warm for him, and neither of them said another word about why that single word had changed the room. By morning, Crosswind had returned to its ordinary noises. Boots on the porch, coffee mugs against the table, Russell calling for 2 men to check the north fence, Jerome carrying in wood before Florence had to ask. Miles came through the kitchen shortly after sunrise, dressed for the cold, the repaired glove on his left hand. He set his empty coffee mug beside the basin. Third yearling came back on its own. Florence looked up from biscuit dough. "Smarter than the first 2. "Smarter than me, apparently. I spent half the night looking for it." "You said it." He gave her that small look that was almost a smile and went outside. Neither mentioned the word home. The next few days settled into something easier. Not familiar exactly, but close enough that Florence began noticing when Miles had not passed through the kitchen by noon. She disliked noticing that, so she kept busy. There was plenty to do. The missing freight still had not arrived. She had started a second ledger now, one for what was used each day and another for what should have come in from Millstone. She wrote dates carefully. November 28th, no flour. November 29th, no coffee. December 1st, still nothing. The weather stayed cold but clear. The road remained passable. That bothered her more than snow would have. On the afternoon of December 3rd, a rider came through the Crosswind gate shortly after 2. Florence saw him from the kitchen window. Dark town coat, polished boots, a bay horse too well groomed for ranch work. She knew who it was before he dismounted. Gordon Talbot. Her hand stopped on the bread knife. Across the yard, Miles came out of the barn. He stood still for half a second, then walked toward the horse. Gordon removed his gloves. Corbett. Talbot. Neither man offered his hand. Florence looked back at the cutting board. She finished slicing the loaf. By the time the kitchen door opened, she had arranged the bread in a basket and set the knife down. Gordon entered first. Miles remained behind him. Florence. She wiped her hands. Mr. Talbot? Gordon looked around the kitchen. He took in the clean shelves, the rows of labeled jars, the ledger near the flour bin, the large kettle simmering on the stove. You've made yourself comfortable. I've made the kitchen usable. His mouth tightened slightly. Miles leaned against the doorframe. Florence did not ask him to leave. Gordon removed his hat. I came to offer you work. She looked at him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then she said, I already have work. I heard your arrangement here was temporary. It is. Then there's no conflict. Florence folded the dish towel once. What work? Gordon relaxed a little, as if the question meant she had already moved closer to accepting. The Grand Union is expanding the dining room. I've hired a new hostess from Boise. Good manners, presentable, knows how to handle travelers. Florence said nothing. I need someone who can manage the kitchen properly. You had someone. Gordon looked at the stove. Things were complicated. They weren't. His eyes lifted to hers. Florence waited. Gordon sighed. I'll pay you more than before. How much? $28 a month. It was good money. Better than she had expected him to offer. Behind Gordon, Miles did not move. Florence said, And where would I work? The same kitchen. And the dining room. Gordon hesitated. There it was. Florence felt something inside her go very quiet. The new hostess will handle the public side, he said. Meaning? Florence. Meaning. He lowered his voice. The Grand Union is trying to attract railroad men and freight buyers, families from Boise. Men with money. They expect a certain appearance. Miles straightened. Florence saw it from the corner of her eye. Gordon continued. You know how people are. Florence looked at him, no. Tell me. His face flushed. I don't intend to insult you. Then this should be easy. He glanced once toward Miles, then back. You are an excellent cook. No one has ever disputed that. But? Gordon rubbed one thumb along the edge of his hat. But some people are more suited to the front room than others. The kitchen became so quiet, Florence could hear the stovepipe ticking. Gordon pressed on. You have real skill. There's dignity in using it where it belongs. Miles pushed away from the doorframe. That's enough. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Gordon turned. I wasn't speaking to you. Miles took one step forward. Florence lifted one hand. That was all. Miles stopped. Not reluctantly. Immediately. Florence noticed that too. She walked toward the pantry. On the top shelf, behind 2 jars of dried beans, sat a small iron key on a piece of string. She had carried it from Millstone without knowing why. The old Grand Union kitchen key. Gordon had forgotten to ask for it. Florence took it down. She returned to the table and placed it in his palm. His fingers closed around it. I wondered where that went. I kept thinking it meant I might still have a place there. Gordon's face shifted. Florence. She shook her head. I was grateful once. He stopped. She looked at the key in his hand, then at him. I was grateful for every hour you gave me, every extra supper, every time you let me stay after the regular work dried up. Gordon glanced toward Miles again. Florence did not. I thought if I worked hard enough, eventually you'd trust me where people could see me. That wasn't... I understand now. Her voice stayed even. I was grateful until I understood you were paying me to disappear. Gordon stood with the key pressed into his palm. For once, he had no answer ready. Florence moved back toward the stove. The bread will burn if I leave it. That ended the conversation. Gordon put on his hat. He walked out. Miles followed him into the yard. Florence did not go to the window. She took the bread from the oven, set it on the cooling board, brushed the tops with butter. Her hands did not shake until the fourth loaf. She put the brush down. Outside, voices carried faintly through the wall. Gordon first. Low, tight, then Miles. Florence could not make out the words. She stepped closer to the stove. The outer door opened. Miles came back in alone. He removed his hat. Florence kept her eyes on the bread. Gone? Yes. She nodded. Miles stood by the table. After a moment, he said, You should have been in that dining room. Florence looked up. What? At the supper. She stared at him. People were asking who made the food. He knew he let them think whatever they wanted. Florence looked back at the loaves. That's how he preferred it. Miles's jaw tightened. She saw it and almost smiled. Don't be angrier than I am. I'm working on it. That did make her smile, only briefly. Miles looked at the expression as though he had nearly missed something important. Then he reached for his hat again. At the door, he stopped. Florence. She waited. I don't care who stands in my front room. He glanced around the kitchen. I care whether the work gets done right. Her fingers rested on the edge of the cooling board. I know, Miles nodded. He left. Florence returned to the bread. It was not until near supper that Russell came in carrying a feed invoice and muttering about the cost of oats. He set the paper down. Talbot looked sour riding out. Florence said, He didn't get what he came for. Russell grunted. Good. Then he hesitated. Passed him at the lower gate. Florence looked up. He say something? Russell's mouth flattened. To Miles. What? Russell clearly did not want to repeat it. That was enough to make Florence ask again. What did he say? Russell looked toward the window, then back at her. Said, You may find feeding her costs more than hiring her. The kitchen went still. Florence's hand tightened around the invoice. Not because the words were new, only because she had heard versions of them all her life. Too much cloth, too much chair, too much supper, too much room. She folded the invoice once, carefully. Behind her, the kitchen door opened. Miles came in carrying snow on his coat and stopped when he saw her face. Russell looked at him, then at Florence, and quietly left. Miles took off his gloves. What's wrong? Florence looked at him. For one moment she considered saying nothing. Then she set the folded invoice on the table. What exactly did Gordon say to you at the gate? Miles became very still. Florence stood at the work table with both hands resting beside the folded feed invoice. The stove gave off a low, steady heat. Outside, snow had begun drifting past the kitchen window in thin, slanting lines. Miles looked toward the door Russell had just gone through, then back at her. He said I might find feeding you cost more than hiring you. Florence nodded once. There it was, plainly spoken. Miles took a step closer. I told him to get off my land. She looked down at the invoice. That sounds like you. He had no right. Men don't usually wait for a right. He studied her face. Florence turned toward the stove and lifted the lid from a pot that did not need checking. Miles stayed where he was. He was trying to insult you. I know. I don't agree with him. I know that too. The answer came too quickly. Miles heard it. He lowered his voice. Then why are you standing there like I said it? Florence set the lid down. For a moment she did not answer. Then she said, because he said it out loud. Miles waited. Florence folded the towel across the oven handle. There are things people say often enough that you stop hearing the exact words. You just start making adjustments. What kind of adjustments? She looked at him. Smaller helpings when someone is watching. Standing instead of taking the last chair. Buying cloth from a woman who doesn't sigh when she measures it. Miles's jaw tightened. Florence gave him a faint, tired look. Don't. Don't what? Look like you're planning to ride back to Millstone and knock Gordon Talbot into a water trough. I wasn't. You were considering something close. That almost broke his expression. Almost. Florence turned back to supper. I'm all right. Miles did not say that she was not. He simply picked up the feed invoice, unfolded it, and laid it flat again. All right, he said. But he stayed in the kitchen until the men came in. The next morning the snow deepened. By noon, the north fence posts carried white caps and the yard had gone quiet under 6 inches of fresh powder. A team from a neighboring spread passed the lower road heading toward Millstone, wheels chained and horses blowing steam. Crosswind's freight did not come. Florence counted again. 7 sacks of flour, 4 coffee tins, half a barrel of beans, 2 sacks of sugar, salt enough for the moment, lamp oil lower than she liked. She wrote everything down. December 6th, no delivery. December 8th, no delivery. December 10th. Miles sent Russell into Millstone. Russell returned after dark with a folded message from Milton Voss. Road unsafe above the lower cut. Delivery delayed until conditions improve. Florence read it beside the lamp. Conditions improved yesterday. Russell pulled off his gloves. That's what I told Voss. What did he say? That his teams don't move on wishes. Miles stood near the stove. Florence looked at him. Did you pay him? In advance. All of it? Half, receipt? Miles crossed to the desk in the adjoining room and returned with a folded paper. Florence opened it. Milton Voss freight and transfer. 2 winter loads. Flour, coffee, sugar, beans, salt, lamp oil. First shipment due November 24th. Second by December 12th, weather permitting. Florence ran one finger beneath the line. Weather permitting. Miles saw it. Convenient. Very. 3 days later, Florence rode into Millstone with Russell for dry goods. The road was hard-packed and cold. Crowfoot Pass itself lay farther west, higher in the mountains, but the lower road remained open enough that wagons had cut deep tracks through the snow. That was the first thing Florence noticed. The second was the freight team unloading outside Nellie Brooks's general store. 3 wagons, Voss's mark on the canvas. Florence stepped down from Russell's sleigh and looked at the flour sacks stacked on the boardwalk. Nellie Brooks came through the store door, wearing a brown wool shawl and carrying a pencil behind one ear. Florence. Nellie. They had known each other enough to speak plainly. Florence nodded toward the wagons. Those come through today? This morning. From where? South Route. 2 loads from Boise, 1 from Arco. Florence looked back at the ruts in the street. Road bad? Nellie glanced at her. Not bad enough to stop them. Russell heard. His mouth hardened. Nellie lowered her voice. Why? Florence took the folded Voss receipt from her coat pocket. Crosswind's been waiting since November. Nellie read the paper, then looked past Florence toward the Voss wagons. That doesn't sound right. No. Nellie handed the receipt back. I'll keep my ears open. Florence tucked it away. Don't make trouble for yourself. Nellie gave her a dry look. I'm 45 and own the only store in Millstone where Voss can buy lamp chimneys without riding 20 miles. He can survive my curiosity. Florence almost smiled. On the ride home, Russell said little. Neither did Florence. By the time they reached Crosswind, the sky had gone iron gray. Miles was waiting near the barn. Russell gave him the news before the horses were fully stopped. Voss had 3 wagons in Millstone today. Miles looked at Florence. You're sure? I watched them unload. A muscle moved in his cheek. What were they carrying? Flour, among other things. Miles looked toward the mountains, then back to the ranch. I'll deal with him. Florence heard the sentence. She also heard what it did not solve. The food was still missing. The next week became a matter of subtraction. Less sugar in the oatmeal, more cornmeal, smaller biscuits, beans stretched with beef broth, dried apples used only where they mattered. Florence never announced the changes. The men noticed anyway. No one complained. Jerome began carrying in extra wood. Russell stopped taking a second cup of coffee unless Florence offered it. Miles stopped taking sugar entirely. She saw that. She saw everything. And without making a decision about it, Florence began leaving a little food on her own plate. Then a little more. One evening, Miles sat across from her after the men had gone. He watched her break a biscuit in half. You don't like those anymore? Florence looked up. What? You've been making them the same way for weeks. I'm not hungry. Miles looked at the half biscuit, then at her. He said nothing. That made it worse. Florence got up and carried the plate to the basin. Her 6-week agreement ended on December 18th. She knew the date without looking. The paper had lived in her trunk since Millstone. That morning she took it out, read it once, folded it again. By afternoon, snow was falling hard enough to blur the barn from her east room window. Florence packed slowly. 3 work dresses, the church dress, aprons, recipe book, tin box. She left the kitchen ledgers downstairs. Those belonged to Crosswind now. She had just closed the trunk when the bedroom door opened a few inches and stopped against the lock chain she had forgotten to set fully. Miles knocked once. Florence? She opened it. His eyes went immediately to the trunk. Something in his face changed. You're leaving. My agreement ended today. I know what day it is. She looked at him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Miles said, Did Gordon come back? No. Did somebody say something? No. Then why? Florence kept one hand on the trunk lid. You've got 18 men, I know. Your flour's disappearing faster than it should. Coffee's nearly gone. Sugar won't last another month. Voss may not bring anything until January. Florence, you don't need another person eating through winter. The words stayed between them. Miles looked at her. Not at the trunk. Not at the room, at her. Florence felt the old instinct rise. Explain less. Take up less. Make the decision easy for him. She reached for the trunk strap. Miles crossed the room. He put one large hand flat on the lid, then he closed it. Not hard, just firmly enough that the brass latch clicked. Florence stared at his hand. Miles said, "I didn't ask how much you eat, Florence." She looked up. His voice was quieter now. "I asked why you're packing." Florence kept her hand on the trunk strap. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was snow brushing against the window glass. "My agreement is finished," she said. Miles nodded. "I know. You hired me for 6 weeks. I know that too. And Crosswind is short on everything that matters. That doesn't answer me." Florence looked at him then. He was standing close enough that she had to tilt her head to meet his eyes, one hand still resting on the trunk lid, his coat damp at the shoulders where snow had melted into the wool. She said, "You have 18 men who work for you. Horses, cattle, a winter road that may close. You're already counting flour by the sack and coffee by the spoon. I can do that arithmetic. So can I." "Then you know what I mean." "No." The answer came flat and immediate. Florence's mouth tightened. Miles took his hand off the trunk. "If this is about wages, we settle wages. It isn't. If it's about the room, it isn't. Then stop deciding for me what I can afford." That landed harder than she expected. She folded her arms. "I'm trying not to be another problem." Miles stared at her, then something in his face changed. Not anger. Something lower and more tired. "Florence." She looked away. He waited until she looked back. "You are not a problem measured in pounds of flour." Her throat tightened. Miles continued before she could interrupt. "You've got those men eating better on less than Billy used to waste in a week. Russell says stores are lasting longer than they did last winter, even with Voss holding half of what I bought. If I lose you now, I don't save food. I lose the person keeping what food I have from being wasted." Florence said nothing. Miles glanced toward the trunk. "Your contract ended." "Yes." "So we'll write another." "For how long?" He hesitated. That hesitation changed the room. Florence saw him choose his next words carefully. "I don't know." She gave a short breath that almost became a laugh. "That's not much of an offer." "No." He looked at her directly. "So I'll say the part I do know." Florence waited. Miles's voice dropped. "Stay because I want you here. No mention of biscuits, no mention of 18 men, no mention of winter cattle." Florence's fingers loosened against her sleeve. Miles seemed to realize only after saying it how little distance remained between them. He stepped back half a pace, not because he regretted the words, because he was giving her room to decide what to do with them. Florence looked at the packed trunk, then at the folded 6-week agreement lying on top of her recipe book. "I'll need $30 this time." Miles blinked. "30? You offered it the first time." The corner of his mouth moved. "I did. And I was foolish enough to bargain you down. 28, 30, done." Florence reached for the trunk latch. She opened it again. Miles stood there another second. Then he nodded once and left her to unpack. By supper, no one knew she had nearly gone. At least Florence thought no one knew. Jerome came through the kitchen door carrying twice the usual amount of wood and stacked it beside the stove without being asked. Russell brought in a sack of dried corn from the tack room and said he'd remembered it had been stored there after Roundup. Dell was not there because there was no Dell at Crosswind, and Florence was grateful for that small fact because she had enough men learning to hover helpfully without another one. Miles came in last. He set a fresh sheet of paper beside her ledger. $30. No end date. Either party could end the arrangement with 7 days' notice. Florence read it. At the bottom, he had added one line. Kitchen authority unchanged. She folded the paper and slipped it into her apron pocket. Better. I learn. Slowly. Still counts. The shortage changed the kitchen. Florence stopped planning meals by preference and began planning them by endurance. Beef bones were roasted twice before they were discarded. Cornmeal appeared more often. Potatoes became bread when flour had to be saved. Dried apples went into puddings, stews, and one surprisingly good breakfast cake that Russell claimed looked suspicious until he ate 2 pieces. Coffee grew weaker. Nobody complained. Miles stopped taking a second cup. Florence noticed that too. She also noticed that her own plate returned to normal because he had a habit now of looking at it once before leaving the table. He never said anything. He did not have to. Christmas came under 3 feet of snow. The mountains disappeared entirely for 2 days behind white weather, and Crowfoot Pass became a rumor beyond the western ridge. Florence decorated the dining room with pine branches Jerome and 2 other hands brought from the lower slope. Russell found a length of red ribbon in an old trunk and tied it badly around the lamp chimney. No one fixed it. Florence used molasses, dried apples, cloves, cinnamon, raisins, and the last small measure of brown sugar to make Jerome's pudding again. This time she made a full pan. At supper, the men were louder than usual. Someone produced a mouth organ. Another man had a deck of cards missing the Queen of Hearts. Russell carved the roast. Miles sat at the head of the table but did not dominate it. He rarely did. Florence served the pudding last. Jerome saw it and stopped talking. He looked at her. She only said, "Eat it before it gets cold." He did. Halfway through the first bite, his face changed. He put his spoon down. Then he smiled. Not much. Enough. Ma used to put raisins in hers. So do I. She soaked them first. So did I. He looked at Florence again. Apple vinegar? Florence nodded. Jerome stared at his bowl for a moment. Then he took another bite. Later, Florence found a folded scrap of paper tucked under the sugar tin. The handwriting leaned hard to the right. Miss Whitcomb, thank you for remembering what I said. No signature. It did not need one. The men drifted toward the bunkhouse after supper. Russell took the cards. Jerome took the mouth organ. Miles remained behind. Florence was rinsing plates in a basin of hot water when she realized he was still at the table. You lose something? She asked. No. Then why are you sitting there? He looked around the empty room. I was thinking. That can be dangerous. So I've heard. Florence dried her hands. Miles glanced toward the doorway where the men had gone. You made Jerome feel like he was at home tonight. Florence picked up a plate. I made pudding. No. She looked at him. He stood. The room seemed smaller when he did. You don't just feed them. Florence's hand stopped on the plate. Miles took one step closer. You remember who misses home, who's hurting, who needs quiet, who needs somebody to ask twice. Florence lowered the plate. People tell you things if you listen. Most people don't. His eyes stayed on hers. There was no joke in them now, no ranch business, no discussion of stores. Florence could hear the stove ticking as it cooled. Miles lifted one hand. Slowly, not touching. His fingers stopped a few inches from her cheek. Florence did not move away. For one suspended second, neither of them seemed to breathe. Then someone pounded on the outer door. Hard. 3 times. Miles's hand dropped. He turned. Russell's voice carried from the front hall. Miles. Something in the tone made him move immediately. Florence followed. When they reached the porch, a teamster stood below the steps, bent forward with both hands on his knees. Ice clung to his beard. His coat was white with road frost. One horse stood behind him, blowing hard in the dark. Miles went down the steps. What happened? The teamster lifted his head. Crosswind load. Florence's stomach tightened. Where is it? Miles asked. The man dragged in a breath, turned back at the lower cut. By weather? The teamster shook his head. No. Miles went still. Then by what? The man looked from Miles to Florence. Voss's order. The Christmas noise from the bunkhouse carried faintly across the yard. A burst of laughter. Someone playing 3 bad notes on the mouth organ. The teamster swallowed. He told the drivers Crosswind freight doesn't move west until he says it does. Florence looked toward the white road disappearing beyond the gate. Miles's face hardened. This was no delay now, no excuse about snow, no bad road. Someone had chosen Crosswind, and whatever came next had already begun. Miles brought the teamster inside before the cold could finish what the road had started. Florence put coffee in front of him, then a bowl of stew. The man held the mug with both hands until feeling came back into his fingers. Russell stood near the stove, hat still on, listening. Tell it straight, Miles said. The teamster swallowed. We got as far as the lower cut. Road was open enough. Snow packed hard, but we were moving. Then, Voss had 2 men waiting. Miles's face did not change. They show you papers? No. Reason? Said Mr. Voss ordered Crosswind freight held in Millstone until further notice. Florence looked toward Miles. Only Crosswind? The teamster nodded. Far as I know. Russell muttered something under his breath. Miles ignored it. Where's the load now? Back at Voss's yard. Florence asked. All of it? Flour, coffee, beans, lamp oil, whatever was on the manifest. Miles reached for his coat. Florence knew what he was thinking before he moved. You aren't riding tonight. He stopped. Outside, wind drove snow against the windows hard enough to make the panes hum. I can make Millstone. No. His eyes came to hers. Florence kept her voice level. You can make the first mile, maybe 5. Then you'll be looking for a fence post in blowing snow while the horse decides whether you're worth following. Russell said, She's right. Miles looked at him. Russell shrugged. Don't enjoy saying it. The teamster bent over his stew. Miles slowly removed his coat again. He hung it on the peg. Morning. Florence went back to the kitchen. Her hands were steady. Only her thoughts were not. The next day, Nellie Brooks sent a message before Miles could leave. A boy from Millstone arrived just after 9 with a folded note inside his coat. Miles opened it at the dining table. Florence watched his eyes move across the page. What? He handed it to her. Nellie's handwriting was tight and plain. I checked Voss's freight dates. 3 loads crossed Lower Road after yours was stopped. 2 went to Halpern Ranch. 1 to Grand Union. Weather was not the reason. Come see me before you speak to Voss. Florence read it twice. Russell leaned over her shoulder. Well? Miles took the note back. Now we know, no, Florence said. He looked at her. We know he's lying. We don't know why. Miles folded the paper. I intend to ask. Florence wiped flour from her fingers. Ask Nellie first. That earned her a look. Not irritation. Recognition. He had started doing that more lately, looking at her before making a decision that concerned stores, freight, or anything with numbers attached. Miles saddled for Millstone at noon. Russell went with him. They returned near dusk. Florence was at the table trimming turnips when Miles came into the kitchen. His coat carried road dust where the snow had thawed lower down. He set a folded document beside her knife. What is it? Contract. She opened it. The paper concerned Crosswind's spring cattle delivery to a buyer out of Blackfoot. Florence read slowly, moving her finger along the clauses. Then she found the line Miles wanted her to see. Delivery through Crowfoot Pass no later than the final week of March. Failure to complete delivery allowed the buyer to cancel part of the agreement and call the attached note. Florence looked up. How much is the note? Miles named the figure. She stopped cutting turnips. Crosswind could survive a bad winter. It could not comfortably survive that. What secures it? Miles did not answer right away. Florence looked back at the contract, then found the land description. A narrow strip running along the western edge of Crosswind. The strip that touched the freight road before it climbed toward Crowfoot. She set the page down. That's what he wants. Russell stood near the door. Miles nodded. Nellie heard Voss ask the county clerk about that parcel in October. Florence looked at him. Before my freight was ever late. Yes. The room seemed colder despite the stove. Florence folded the contract once. So this isn't about supplies. No. It's about starving the ranch slowly enough that you're forced to choose between feeding men and paying what you owe. Miles's jaw set. Russell said, and if we can't get the herd through in spring, Voss knows where the pressure lands. Florence looked toward the pantry. All those missing sacks. All the careful rationing. Her own half-biscuit. None of it had been accidental. Milton Voss had been counting too. That angered her more than she expected. Not because he had caused hardship, because he had made them doubt their own arithmetic. Miles reached for the contract. We'll find another hauler. In winter? If I have to. And if Voss controls the freight teams willing to take Crowfoot? Miles looked at her. Florence wiped her hands and crossed to the shelf where she kept her ledgers. She brought down both books. What are those? Everything that came into this kitchen. She opened the first. Dates, amounts, what was ordered, what was used. Then the second. Everything that didn't arrive. Miles leaned over the table. Florence turned pages. Your first flour load was due November 24th. Coffee the same day. Salt came short by 30 pounds in the last partial delivery. Lamp oil by 6 tins. Russell stepped closer. You wrote all that? Of course I wrote it. Miles looked at the pages. I told you. You don't feed 18 men through winter by guessing. She pointed to the columns. If Nellie can get dates for every Voss wagon that crossed the lower road, we can compare them. Miles was quiet. Florence continued. And if Gordon's hotel received Voss freight while ours was being held, there'll be purchase entries somewhere. Miles straightened. No. Florence looked up. What? I'll handle Voss. She thought she had misheard him. What do you mean? This is ranch business. The words landed cleanly. Too cleanly. Florence's hand remained on the ledger. So are these. I know. Then use them. I said I'll handle it. Russell looked toward the door. He understood before Miles did. Florence closed the ledger. Slowly. Miles saw the movement. Florence, you hired me to manage provisions. I did. I've been managing them. Yes. And now the missing provisions are part of the reason someone may take your land. Miles rubbed a hand over his face. I know that. Then what exactly do you think I am standing here for? The question was quiet. That made Russell leave. The door closed behind him. Miles lowered his voice. If this turns ugly, Voss won't stop at paperwork. Florence said nothing. I've dealt with men like him. So have I. Not like this. Her face changed. Only slightly. Miles realized it. Too late. Florence stepped back from the table. You don't know that. I mean, this is my ranch. There, the sentence hung between them. Miles closed his eyes for half a second. Florence went still, not angry in the way he expected. Worse. She reached for the ledgers. Miles said, That's not how I meant it. No. Florence. She tucked the books beneath one arm. You were clear. I was trying to keep you out of something that may become dangerous, and I was trying to help you keep Crosswind. I know. Do you? Miles opened his mouth. Nothing useful came. Florence looked toward the window. The mountains had disappeared behind evening cloud. You said I didn't have to decide for you what you could afford. Miles's face tightened. She looked back at him. Don't decide for me what I can stand beside. He had no answer to that. Florence carried the ledgers into the pantry. Miles remained at the table. The next morning, they spoke only about breakfast. That afternoon, only about coffee. The silence between them had edges now. At dusk, Miles saddled his horse. Russell caught him near the porch. Storm coming. I know. Millstone can wait. No. Florence stood inside the kitchen doorway. Miles saw her. For one moment, he seemed ready to come back in. Apologize. Explain. Anything. Instead, he put one boot in the stirrup. Florence turned away first. He rode toward Millstone under a sky already filling with snow. The storm slowed him enough that he did not return until the following afternoon. Crosswind came into view through drifting white. The barn, the smoke, the porch. Everything looked as it should. Miles handed his horse to Jerome and went inside. The kitchen was warm. Russell was sitting at the table drinking coffee. Miles looked toward the stove. Where's Florence? Russell did not answer immediately. Miles's eyes moved to the peg beside the kitchen door. Her shawl was gone. He crossed the hall. The door to the east room stood open. The bed was made. The washstand was dry. The trunk was gone. Miles stopped in the doorway. On the small table lay the kitchen keys. Beside them, one folded sheet of paper. Nothing else. Miles picked it up. The handwriting was Florence's, neat and square even when written in haste. Russell, the stores will last 10 days if you follow the ration ledger exactly. Use the dried beans before opening the second cornmeal sack. Keep the coffee to 1 full pot at breakfast and 1 at supper. Do not let Jerome convince you the men need biscuits twice a day. The inventory is current as of yesterday morning. F.W. Miles read it twice. There was no explanation, no accusation, no farewell, not one word for him. Russell had come up behind him but stayed in the hall. She left yesterday. Miles folded the note. With who? Nellie Brooks's freight wagon. Came through before the snow thickened. Why didn't you stop her? Russell looked at him. Miles knew how foolish the question sounded before Russell answered. She's 33 years old. Miles closed his eyes briefly. Right. She said she needed to go to Millstone. Anything else? No. Miles looked around the little room. Florence had left it exactly as she found it. Blanket folded, water pitcher emptied. No hairpins beside the mirror. No apron hanging behind the door. It should not have looked different. It did. He went back to the kitchen. The men were eating noon dinner. Russell had heated Florence's stew. Jerome sat in her usual chair without realizing it. Then he saw Miles looking and stood so fast his spoon struck the bowl. Sorry. Miles frowned. For what? Jerome looked at the chair, then away. Nothing. He moved to another seat. No one spoke much after that. Miles sat down. There was food in front of him. Good food. Florence had prepared enough for 2 days before leaving. He ate because there was work to do. It tasted exactly as it had the day before. That was the problem. Nothing in the kitchen had changed except the person missing from it. He noticed things he had never consciously noticed before. The scrape of Florence's knife against the cutting board. Gone. The little sound she made when a stove draft refused to behave. Gone. The way she set his coffee on the table without asking whether he wanted it. Gone. By evening, the house felt larger. Miles hated that. At supper, Jerome reached automatically toward the biscuit basket, then stopped. She said once a day now. Russell nodded. Once a day. The basket stayed where it was. Miles looked at Florence's empty chair. That night he slept badly, not because of the storm. The storm passed before midnight. He lay awake listening to the house settle and heard over and over the sentence he had said. This is my ranch. At the time it had felt like responsibility. Now it sounded like a door closing. Before sunrise, Miles dressed and went to the kitchen. Russell was already there trying to make coffee. The first pot was weak. The second was worse. Miles drank it anyway. I'm riding to Millstone. Russell did not look surprised. Road's rough. I know. You going after Voss? Miles pulled on his gloves. Florence first. Russell looked up then. Miles met his eyes. I owe her an apology. Russell took a slow drink of bad coffee. That's probably wise. Miles pointed at him. You could pretend not to enjoy this. I could. Russell did not. Miles left at first light. The road south was hard where wind had packed the snow and treacherous where drifts crossed the low places. He rode carefully, passing the second creek crossing shortly after 9 and the old lime kiln before 10. All the way to Millstone, he worked through what he would say. He had never enjoyed apologizing. Not because he believed himself always right. Because apology required exactness. You had to name what you had done. Anything less was only noise. By the time the roofs of Millstone appeared below him, he had settled on the words. I was wrong. I treated your judgment like it mattered until I became afraid. Then I shut you out. You did not deserve that. He repeated them once. They did not improve. Main Street was churned brown where wagon wheels had broken through yesterday's snow. Smoke rose from the hotel chimney. A freight sled stood outside the livery, its runners caked with ice. Miles tied his horse at Nellie Brooks's store. The bell over the door rang when he entered. Nellie looked up from weighing coffee. Her expression told him she knew exactly why he was there. Morning, Miles. Nellie. She finished measuring the coffee for an elderly customer. Miles waited. When the woman had gone, Nellie folded her arms. If you're here to drag Florence back to Crosswind, save yourself the trouble. I'm not dragging anybody. Good. I came to apologize. Nellie's eyebrows rose. That might get you through the next door. Miles looked toward the back of the store. What door? Nellie came around the counter. She's been here since yesterday. His shoulders loosened before he could stop them. Nellie noticed. She said nothing. Instead, she led him through a narrow passage between shelves of canned peaches and lamp chimneys. At the back stood a small storeroom warmed by an iron stove. Florence sat at a table beneath the window. For 1 second, Miles simply stopped. She had not been sitting there waiting for him. She had been working. Papers covered the table. Freight receipts. Store invoices. Copied dates. A hotel purchase book he recognized from the Grand Union's counter. Florence wore the same brown work dress she had left Crosswind in. Her sleeves were rolled up. Her hair had loosened at one temple. A pencil rested between her fingers. She looked up, neither of them spoke. Nellie looked from one to the other. I have shelves to count. She left and closed the door. Miles removed his hat. Florence looked back down at the papers. If you've come to tell me the kitchen is falling apart, Russell has instructions. I didn't. Good. Miles stepped toward the table. I came to say I was wrong. Florence's pencil stopped. He continued before he could lose the exactness. I treated your judgment like it mattered until I got afraid. Then I decided I knew what you could handle better than you did. She looked at him. Miles swallowed. You did not deserve that. Silence. The stove gave a small pop behind him. Florence set the pencil down. No. Miles waited. You didn't. I know. Her eyes stayed on his face. He did not defend himself. That mattered. Florence looked toward the papers. I wasn't trying to punish you. I know that too. I came here because Nellie had records I needed. Miles moved closer. What records? Florence reached for one receipt. Voss's freight dates, then another. Gordon's purchases. Miles stared at the table. You went to Gordon? Eventually. He gave you his books? Not willingly. That almost made him smile. Almost. Florence slid 3 sheets into a row. Look. Miles bent over the table. November 26th. Grand Union Hotel. 25 pounds coffee. 2 sacks flour. Lamp oil. Supplier listed as Voss transfer. Another purchase followed 6 days later. More flour. Beans. Sugar. Miles frowned. That's ordinary hotel freight. It would be. Florence opened her kitchen ledger. Except this. She pointed to Crosswind's original order. Their first delayed shipment. 2 sacks flour. 25 pounds coffee. 6 tins lamp oil. Beans. Sugar. The amounts were close enough to be uncomfortable. Miles looked again. Florence brought out another page. This is Voss's warehouse receipt from the load that supposedly couldn't cross the lower road. Where'd you get that? Nellie knows a clerk who likes being paid what he's owed. Miles stared at the dates. The shipment returned to Millstone on November 25th. The Grand Union purchased nearly identical quantities the next morning. Florence tapped one line with her finger. Look at the sack marks. Miles leaned closer. Crosswind's supplier code, partially crossed out, still visible. His face hardened. He sold our freight, some of it, to Gordon. Looks that way. Miles straightened. Does Gordon know? I don't think he knew at first. At first? Florence pushed another invoice toward him. December 3rd. Miles read it. The day Gordon had ridden to Crosswind. A second Grand Union purchase from Voss. Flour, coffee, salt. Exactly the goods from Crosswind's second shipment. Florence leaned back. Gordon knew by then that something was wrong. Maybe not everything, but enough. Miles looked at the papers spread across the table, then at Florence. She had left Crosswind with no speech, no demand, no promise she would return. He had thought she was walking away from the trouble. Instead, she had followed it. Florence picked up one final receipt. Her finger rested beneath Milton Voss's signature. Miles. He looked at her. She pushed the page across the table. Milton didn't lose our flour. Her eyes did not leave his. He sold it twice. Miles looked back down at the invoice. For several seconds, the room seemed to hold its breath with them. The stove clicked softly. Someone moved a crate in the front of Nellie's store. A wagon rolled past outside, iron rim grinding over frozen ruts. Miles picked up the receipt again. Can you prove this is ours? Florence opened her kitchen ledger and turned 3 pages. I can prove what we ordered. I can prove what never arrived. I can prove the amounts Gordon bought the morning after Voss brought our freight back into Millstone. She slid another page toward him. And this number here. Miles bent closer. What is it? The supplier mark from the original flour sacks. I wrote it down because one of the first sacks at Crosswind had a split seam, and I wanted to make sure the next load matched. Miles looked at her. You wrote the sack mark. I write down what comes into my kitchen. There was no pride in the sentence, only fact. That made it stronger. Miles leaned back from the table. You were right. Florence's eyes narrowed slightly. About what? The ledgers. She said nothing. I should have listened before I wrote out. Yes. He accepted that too. A moment later, Nellie opened the storeroom door. Gordon's here. Florence looked toward the front. Miles's expression changed. Why? I sent for him. Miles turned back to her. You sent for Gordon? Florence stood. He bought the goods. I want to hear him explain why. You want me in the room? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes. It was a small thing. Miles understood what it cost her to say it after the way they had parted. He put his hat under one arm and followed her. Gordon stood near the front counter, brushing snow from his coat. He looked annoyed until he saw Florence. Then he saw Miles behind her. The annoyance sharpened. What is this? Florence placed the first invoice on the counter. You bought flour from Milton Voss on November 26th. Gordon glanced at the paper. I buy flour every week. 2 sacks. So? 25 pounds of coffee. Gordon looked at her more carefully. Florence put down the second invoice. And 6 tins of lamp oil. Miles said nothing. He did not need to. Gordon read the page. Where did you get this? Your own purchase book. Gordon's eyes flicked toward Nellie. She folded her arms. Don't look at me. It's your handwriting. Florence placed Crosswind's order beside it. Those amounts match a shipment paid for by Crosswind. Gordon's face hardened. That's coincidence. Then let's try another. She put down the December receipt. Flour, coffee, salt, beans. Another near-perfect match. Gordon stopped talking. Florence watched his face. That was when she knew. You knew. He shook his head too fast. No. You knew by December. I knew Voss was selling stock cheap. Stock he didn't own. I didn't know that. Miles spoke for the first time. When did you start wondering? Gordon looked at him. Miles's voice remained level. When did the price get low enough that you knew something was wrong? Gordon's jaw worked. Florence waited. Nellie reached behind the counter, took out a receipt book, and began straightening papers that were already straight. No one rushed Gordon. Eventually, he said, "The second delivery." Florence felt her fingers tighten against the counter. Gordon looked down. The first one, I thought Voss had overstock. The second time, the price was too low. And you bought it anyway, Florence said. He rubbed a hand over his mouth. Business was slow. She looked at him. He could not hold her eyes for long. Miles said, "Did Voss tell you where it came from?" "No." "Did you ask?" Gordon was silent. That was answer enough. Florence gathered the receipts. Gordon looked at her. "What exactly do you want from me?" "The invoices. You have them, all of them." His face changed. "No." Florence waited. Gordon straightened. "I am not putting my hotel in the middle of whatever fight Corbett has with Voss. You already are." Florence. "No." Her voice stayed quiet. "You bought goods that had already been paid for. Maybe you didn't know the first time. You knew enough the second time." Gordon looked toward Miles. Miles did not rescue him. Florence continued. "Milton Voss is trying to force Crosswind into missing a cattle contract. If he succeeds, he wants the Western Road parcel." Gordon frowned. "What?" Miles finally stepped forward. "That's the reason he's holding freight." Gordon's confidence faltered. Florence saw it. Not guilt this time. Fear. Miles saw it too. Gordon. Gordon looked at him. "If this becomes a territorial fraud complaint, who do you think Voss says bought the goods?" Gordon went pale around the mouth. Nellie stopped pretending to arrange receipts. Miles continued. "He's got freight books, drivers, warehouse men. If somebody has to explain missing cargo, he won't volunteer himself first." Gordon looked down at the invoices. Florence understood what Miles was doing. Not threatening, showing him where the ground actually lay. After a long moment, Gordon said, "There are 4 more receipts." Florence did not move. "Where? Hotel office? Bring them." Gordon looked at her. "You really think this saves Crosswind?" "No." That answer surprised him. Florence picked up her ledger. "I think truth is useful whether it saves us or not." Something in Gordon's face folded inward. He put on his gloves. "I'll bring them." He left without another word. Nellie watched through the window until he crossed the street. Then she said, "I always did like you better when you stopped being polite." Florence almost smiled. Miles did. Barely. By afternoon, the remaining invoices lay on Nellie's table. The pattern was worse than Florence expected. Crosswind's missing supplies appeared again and again in smaller lots. Not always identical, but close enough. Flour split into 2 sales. Coffee divided between hotel and freight kitchen. Lamp oil redirected to a ranch south of town. Voss had not merely withheld Crosswind's freight. He had turned it into profit twice over. Miles sent a telegram from the depot that evening. The reply came the following morning. Elmer Shaw arrived from Blackfoot 2 days later in a dark overcoat and boots whitened with road salt. He was 61, narrow in the shoulders, with wire spectacles and the habit of reading documents in complete silence before saying anything at all. He spent nearly an hour at Nellie's back table with Florence's ledgers. No one interrupted him. Finally, he removed his spectacles. "Mrs. Whitcomb," Miss. Miss Whitcomb. He tapped the ledger. Who kept these? I did. Every day? Every day. Why? Florence looked at him. Because people eat every day. Elmer stared at her for a moment. Then one corner of his mouth lifted. Fair answer. Miles sat across from him. Can we use it? Oh, yes. Elmer put his spectacles back on. The hotel invoices establish resale. Miss Whitcomb's records establish what Crosswind was supposed to receive and what failed to arrive. Voss's warehouse marks give us the bridge. Miles leaned forward. So we're done. Elmer looked up. No. The word was flat enough to stop the room. Florence folded her hands. What are we missing? Time. Elmer turned toward Miles. You can pursue Voss. You can seek repayment. You may even have grounds to involve territorial authorities if we establish deliberate diversion. Then what's the problem? Elmer took a second document from his case. Miles recognized it immediately. The cattle contract. Florence's stomach tightened. Elmer opened it. Your delivery deadline is 6 days from today. Miles said nothing. Crowfoot Pass is still unstable. The buyer has no obligation to extend the date because your freight contractor cheated you. Florence looked at Miles. He looked back. Elmer continued. If you miss the deadline, Voss may lose the legal fight and still get exactly what he wanted. The room grew quiet. Outside, thaw water dripped from Nellie's roof in slow, steady taps. Florence looked down at the cattle contract. 6 days, all the invoices, all the proof, all the numbers she had kept. None of it would move a single steer through Crowfoot Pass. Miles closed the document. When does the weather break? Nellie answered from the counter. Teamsters are saying tomorrow afternoon. Florence looked toward the window. The clouds over the western ridge had lifted just enough to show one strip of pale sky. Miles saw it too. He stood. We leave at first light. By the time Miles and Florence reached Crosswind that evening, the ranch had already begun moving. Russell had men sorting saddles under the barn lanterns. Jerome was checking cinches twice. 2 wagons stood near the supply shed with canvas tops rolled back, and their beds half loaded with blankets, grain, cookware, and whatever food Florence had ordered brought out before leaving Millstone. She went straight to the kitchen. No speech, no pause. She took down the ration ledger, opened the pantry, and began counting. Miles came in 10 minutes later. You're not going. Florence did not look up. That's not a question. The pass is bad. So is the deadline. I need you here. She turned then. No. You need the person who knows exactly how much food is on those wagons, how far it will stretch, and which teamsters told me the old logging cut still crosses the lower ridge. Miles frowned. What logging cut? Florence pulled a folded scrap from her pocket. She had drawn the route from memory. Freight drivers used it years ago when the main Crowfoot Road washed out. It comes off below Split Rock, runs through timber, then meets the pass above the west bench. Russell entered behind Miles. He leaned over the paper. Haven't used that cut in years. Is it still there? Russell studied it. Parts of it. Miles shook his head. Not with Florence. She looked at him. He knew that look now. I mean, the route is rough. I heard you. Florence. She folded the map once. Don't ask me to stand beside you only when standing is easy. The words took the room out from under him. Russell looked very carefully at the wall. Miles held Florence's gaze. Then he exhaled through his nose. You ride with the supply wagon. I had planned to. You stay with Russell if the trail breaks. I'll stay where I'm useful. That was the closest either of them came to an argument. At 4 the next morning, Crosswind woke in darkness. Lanterns swung in the yard. Breath smoked white from horses and men. The herd moved like a dark, restless mass beyond the corrals, hooves knocking frozen ground. Florence wore a heavy wool coat over her work dress, stout boots, leather gloves, and a scarf wound close around her neck. She rode the front bench of the first supply wagon beside Jerome until the trail steepened, then climbed down to walk portions where the team needed less weight. The morning passed slowly, cold but clear. By noon, the herd had reached the lower shoulder below Crowfoot. Miles rode back and forth along the line, his height making him easy to spot even at a distance. He checked the wagons twice. The second time, Florence handed him bread and dried beef without asking. "You eat." "I am." "Now." He looked at the food, then at her. "Yes, ma'am." Jerome grinned. Miles saw him. "Something funny?" "No, sir." "Good." He ate while riding. The abandoned logging cut appeared near mid-afternoon. At first it looked like nothing more than a gap between pines. Russell rode ahead. Florence climbed down with the map in one hand and walked to where the old track dipped through packed snow. There were still signs of it. A cut bank, rotting ties from an old skidway, 2 axe-blazed trees, scarred almost smooth with age. Russell came back. Passable. Miles looked toward the main trail. Farther west, 2 freight teams stood where the road narrowed. Voss's mark showed on the wagon canvas, blocking nothing outright, only occupying exactly the place Crosswind would need to use. Florence saw Miles understand. He did not ride toward them. He turned his horse toward the trees. Logging cut. The herd shifted north. For several hours, the route worked, barely. Men widened turns with axes. Wagon wheels bumped over roots hidden beneath snow. At one steep bend, Florence ordered half the flour and coffee unloaded and carried forward by hand until the wagon made the grade. No one argued. Not now. The light began failing sooner than she wanted. Mountains did that. One moment there was afternoon. Then shadow filled the timber. Florence checked the stores again. 2 days at full ration. 3 if she cut portions. 4 if they absolutely had to. The sky had changed too. Clouds were gathering over the upper ridge. Russell saw her looking. "Weatherman in Millstone said tomorrow. Weather doesn't read newspapers." Russell grunted. Ahead, someone shouted. A wagon wheel slipped off the packed track. The team lurched sideways. Men ran. Florence reached the bend just as the rear wagon tipped hard against the slope. One wheel lifted, then the whole bed rolled onto its side with a crack of wood and canvas. No one was under it. That was the first blessing. Miles had been riding beside the wagon. His horse shied at the crash. He came out of the saddle badly and struck the frozen slope shoulder first before sliding several feet. Florence heard Jerome shout his name. She was moving before she thought about it. Miles tried to push himself up. His face had gone pale. "I'm all right." Florence knelt beside him. "Don't lie to me when I'm looking at you," Russell arrived. Miles reached for his leg. Ankle. He tried to stand. The leg folded under him. Russell caught his arm before he hit the ground again. Snow began to fall. At first a few flakes, then more. Men were looking toward the herd. The cattle had started bunching in the narrow timber basin, heads turning, nervous at the crash and the wind. Russell looked at Miles. Miles looked past him toward Florence. For one strange second, she saw the question pass through every face around them. The giant cowboy was down. The trail was narrowing. Darkness was coming. Florence stood. "Russell, get him under the wagon canvas." Miles started to protest. "No." Her voice stopped him. She pointed toward the overturned load. Jerome, check every food sack. Anything split goes under cover first. Water next. Then to another hand. Get blankets around whoever's wet. She turned back to Russell. How far to the upper bench? Maybe 2 miles. Can the herd move before daylight? Not safely. Then don't. Russell nodded. Florence looked at the slope. There was a shallow stand of timber 20 yards east, protected from the worst of the wind. Camp there. One of the older hands said, with the cattle packed this close, we keep the cook fires small and downwind. Men eat in shifts. Her mind had narrowed to the things she knew. Food, heat, time, bodies. Miles sat against a rolled blanket, while Russell bound the ankle with cloth and a spare saddle strap. He watched Florence move from wagon to wagon. She did not bark orders. She simply gave them, and men followed. By full dark, the camp had shape. 2 small fires, canvas stretched low against the snow. The injured wagon partly unloaded. Coffee made weak but hot. Beef warmed in kettles. Bread counted before it was passed out. Florence gave Miles a mug. He took it. You should be resting, he said. So should you. He almost smiled. Then pain tightened his face. Florence crouched beside him. Can you ride tomorrow? If the horse behaves? That's not what I asked. Miles looked at her. Yes. She nodded. Good. Snow thickened beyond the canvas. Somewhere outside, cattle shifted in load. Russell came in, ducking under the edge. We can move at first light if the wind drops. Florence looked at the ration ledger in her lap. If it doesn't? Russell did not answer. Miles did. We move anyway. Florence looked at him. No. He frowned. We missed the deadline. If you move blind and lose men or cattle, the deadline won't matter. Miles opened his mouth. She met his eyes. This time he stopped. Not because she was the cook, because she was right. Florence closed the ledger. We wait for light. Outside, the snow kept falling over Crowfoot Pass. Inside the low shelter, Miles Corbett sat with his injured leg stretched before him, while the men who had followed him for years looked to Florence Whitcomb for the next morning. And for the first time since she had walked into Crosswind's ruined kitchen, no one in that camp was wondering whether she belonged there. The storm eased sometime before dawn, not stopped. Eased. Florence knew the difference. The canvas no longer snapped hard enough to tear loose from its ropes, and the snow striking the shelter had softened from a steady hiss to scattered taps. She had slept perhaps 20 minutes. Miles had slept less. Every time she looked toward him, his eyes were open. At 4:30, Russell crawled beneath the canvas and shook snow from his coat. Stars showing east, Florence pushed herself upright. Wind? Coming down. And the herd? Restless. Still together. Miles reached for his boot. Florence caught his wrist. No. I need it on. You need that ankle to fit inside it tomorrow. It has to fit today. She looked at him. Miles looked back. Then, without another word, he let go of the boot. Florence loosened the wrapping Russell had put around his ankle the night before. The swelling was worse, but nothing about the leg looked wrong enough to stop him riding if he could tolerate the pain. She rewound the cloth carefully. Miles watched her hands. You always this bossy before daylight? Only when men are determined to make injuries worse. I'll try to be easier to manage. No, you won't. The corner of his mouth moved. That was enough. By first light, Florence had every man fed. Not well. Enough. Hot cornmeal. Coffee so weak, Jerome stared into his cup as if trying to remember what coffee used to taste like. Half a biscuit each. dried beef divided evenly. No one complained. Russell stood beside Florence with the route map spread across an overturned crate. If we clear the upper bench by 10, we can reach the western drop before dark. If the wagons hold, they'll hold. Florence looked at the overturned wagon. One rear wheel was cracked but usable after Russell's men braced it with spare wood and rawhide. She nodded. Then move the food to the stronger wagon. Blankets split between both. Miles came up behind them with one arm over Jerome's shoulder. He was standing. Barely. Florence looked at his leg. Then at his face, he said, "Don't." I didn't say anything. You were about to. I was considering several things. Save the worst for later. Russell helped him mount. The herd began moving at 7, slowly. The logging cut climbed another mile through timber, then opened onto a windswept shoulder where snow had blown thin over rock. The western sky was pale blue. Beyond the ridge, Crowfoot Pass finally showed itself. The trail dropped sharply before climbing once more through a notch between dark stone walls. Miles stayed mounted. Florence stayed with the supply wagon. Neither pretended the previous night had changed what each knew how to do. Russell handled the herd. Miles directed from horseback when he could. Florence kept men moving by watching the things they forgot to watch themselves. Who had eaten? Who had wet gloves? Which horse needed a longer stop? Which sack had begun leaking flour through a split seam? By noon, they crossed the upper bench. At 2, they reached the western descent. The clouds stayed behind them. That felt like luck. No one said so until Jerome did. Florence handed him a piece of dried apple. Don't tempt it. He put the apple in his mouth and nodded solemnly. The buyer's holding ground lay beyond the far slope. They reached it near sunset the following day. The herd came through thinner, dirtier, and louder than anyone would have preferred. But it came through. Every contracted head that mattered. The buyer's clerk stood beside a rough table outside the stock pens and counted until dark. Miles sat his horse with his injured leg hanging stiff. Florence waited near the wagon. Russell watched the clerk's pencil. At last the man closed the ledger. Delivery accepted. No one cheered immediately. It took a second for the words to settle. Then Jerome let out a yell that startled 3 horses. Russell laughed. One of the older hands slapped another across the back. Miles closed his eyes for a moment. Florence saw his shoulders drop, only slightly. Enough. He looked across the pen toward her. Their eyes met over the backs of cattle and the pale dust rising from the snow-packed yard. Neither waved. Neither needed to. Crosswind still belonged to Crosswind. They stayed one night near the buyer's pens before turning home. Miles's ankle had swollen badly by then, and Florence insisted on putting him in the wagon for part of the return. He argued. She ignored him. Russell helped lift him onto the bench. Miles looked betrayed. Russell said, "I work for the ranch." Miles pointed toward Florence. Russell shrugged. "Apparently I work for the kitchen, too." By the time they reached Crosswind, spring had begun showing at the edges of winter. Not warmly, just enough. Water ran beneath the snow along the south fence. The barn roof dripped at midday. Crowfoot Pass remained white behind them, but the worst of the season had loosened its grip. Elmer Shaw sent word from Blackfoot 3 days later. Gordon's invoices, Florence's ledgers, and the warehouse marks were enough to begin proceedings against Milton Voss for the diverted freight. Repayment would take time. Consequences would take longer. Florence read the letter once and handed it to Miles. He read it sitting at the kitchen table with his ankle propped on a second chair. "You're not smiling. Neither are you." "I don't smile much. I noticed." He folded the letter. "Voss won't get the land." "No." "The contract's fulfilled." "Yes." Miles looked at her. You kept better records than half the businessmen in Millstone. Florence went back to slicing onions. I kept kitchen records. That's what I said. She did smile then. Small, private. The kitchen had returned to itself. The men came and went. Jerome complained that the coffee still hadn't recovered from rationing. Russell claimed the weak coffee had improved his character. No one believed him. For several days, Miles and Florence spoke around everything that had happened, not avoiding it exactly, allowing it to settle. Then one evening, after supper, the ranch quieted earlier than usual. Rain tapped lightly against the kitchen window instead of snow. The stove door stood open, throwing orange light across the floorboards. Miles sat at the same table where Florence had once left his late plate. His ankle was wrapped, but healing. Florence was putting away the last of the clean cups. Miles? You've been staring at that empty mug for 5 minutes. I know. You planning to tell me why? He rubbed one thumb along the handle. I thought I was going to lose the ranch. Florence stopped. He kept his eyes on the mug. Up on that pass. You didn't. I know. He was quiet. Then he looked at her. The night before that, when I came back from Millstone and your room was empty, I thought I'd lost something else, but so. Florence did not move. Miles continued. I walked into the kitchen the next morning and it looked exactly the same. His voice lowered. Same stove, same table, same walls. He looked around, and I hated it. Florence's fingers tightened around the dish towel. Miles stood slowly, careful of the ankle. I could picture Crosswind going back to what it was before you came. He took one step toward her. I didn't like that picture. Florence looked at him. You were angry because I left? No. I was angry because I gave you a reason to. That answer took the edge off something she had not realized she still carried. Miles rested one hand on the back of a chair. There is something else I should have told you a long time ago. Florence waited. The supper in Millstone. She frowned slightly. What about it? I noticed you before I tasted anything. Florence went still. Miles looked toward the kitchen doorway as if he could see that old room again. Gordon came through that partition 3 times while I was eating. He paused. Every time he called for something. More rolls, more gravy. Another pan, Florence remembered. Miles continued. I saw you behind him. You couldn't have seen much. Enough, his gaze returned to hers. You'd hand him what he wanted. He'd go back out. Then you'd stand there for half a second. Florence's throat tightened. What was I doing? Straightening your shoulders. She looked away. Miles did not. Every time. The rain touched the window. Soft. Steady. Miles said, People in that room were praising food you made while he kept you behind a door, and you still went back to work like you knew exactly what the work was worth, even if they didn't. Florence pressed the towel flat against the counter. The food made me ask your name. She looked at him. His expression did not shift. You were why I stayed. Neither of them moved. There was no sudden embrace, no grand speech. Only Miles standing in the kitchen with one hand resting on a chair, and Florence looking at him as though the room had become unfamiliar in some quiet, impossible way. After a moment she said, You could have told me. I didn't think I'd earned the right. And now? He looked at her for a long time. I hope I'm closer. Florence's mouth trembled at one corner. She looked down, then back up. You are. Miles did not touch her. Not yet. He only nodded. and that restraint told her almost as much as the words had. Weeks passed. Snow pulled back from the lower slopes. Mud replaced ice in the yard. The first green showed along the creek. One Sunday morning, Florence entered the kitchen and found Miles already there. 2 folded documents lay on the table. Beside them sat a small, plain ring. Florence stopped in the doorway. Miles looked up. "Morning." She looked at the papers, then at the ring. "Miles." He put both hands flat on the table. "I thought we should talk." Florence remained in the doorway. Morning light had only just begun reaching across the kitchen floor. The stove was warm but not yet hot, and outside, somewhere beyond the porch, a horse stamped once against the soft spring ground. Her eyes went first to the papers, then to the ring. Miles noticed. "The papers first," he said. Florence looked at him. "That sounds serious." "It is." She crossed the room and sat opposite him. The first document was the agreement he had written months earlier after her 6 weeks had ended. $30. No fixed term. Kitchen authority unchanged. Miles slid it toward her. "This one ends today." Florence's fingers stopped on the edge of the paper. For one brief second, the old instinct came back. The one that prepared for loss before anyone had actually said it aloud. Miles saw her face change. "Not because you're leaving." She looked up. He moved the second document forward. It was longer, several pages. Elmer Shaw's handwriting appeared in the margins beside a properly drawn agreement. Florence read the first line. "Whitcomb and Corbett Mountain House." She read it again, then looked at Miles. "What is this?" "The roadside building by the western pasture? The old freight house?" He nodded. "It's got 4 rooms upstairs, a dining room below, and enough yard for 2 wagon teams if we clear the south side." Florence turned another page. Equal interest. Her name appeared beside his. Not employee, not cook. "Partner?" She looked up slowly. Miles said, "Travelers already stop at Crosswind. More will once Voss loses his grip on the route. If he does. He will." There was no boast in it. Only patience. Florence returned to the document. "It needs a proper stove." "I know. Dining room floor is warped." "I know that too." "Roof leaks over the back room." "Russell told me." Florence narrowed her eyes. "You've been planning this." "For a while." "How long?" Miles looked toward the window. "Long enough that Russell is tired of hearing about roof measurements." That pulled a small laugh from her. She turned to the final page. "You put my name first." "Yes." "Why?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "Because it should be." Florence stared at him. Miles tapped one finger against the paper. "You know the food. You know the supplies. You know what travelers need before they know it themselves." He paused. "And I own the building." "Very generous." "I thought so." She shook her head, smiling now. Then her gaze drifted toward the ring. The smile faded into something quieter. Miles reached for it but did not pick it up. "This isn't part of the agreement." Florence met his eyes. "The partnership?" "The ring." She waited. Miles took a breath. He had faced storms with less hesitation. That did something to her. "I want you to marry me." The words were simple. No speech prepared around them. No kneeling. No audience. Just Miles Corbett at the same kitchen table where he had eaten the plate she kept warm for him, looking at her with both hands flat on the wood, as if he needed them there to keep from reaching too soon. Florence looked at the ring. then at the partnership papers. You want an answer now? No. That surprised her. Miles continued, I want the answer you mean. Silence settled between them. Florence touched the corner of the partnership document. If I said no. Miles waited. Would I still have this? His answer came before she finished looking up. Yes, no hesitation, no disappointment disguised as generosity. Just yes. Florence studied his face. Same half? Same half. My name first? Your name first. And the kitchen? God help anyone who argues with you about the kitchen. Her lips pressed together. Miles watched her. Florence put her palm over the ring. Then yes. He did not move. She almost laughed. Miles. Yes? I said yes. I heard you. You don't look like you did. He finally let out the breath he had been holding. Then he stood, slowly, giving her every chance to change the distance between them herself. Florence stood too. Miles picked up the ring. He held it near her hand, but stopped. She extended her fingers. Only then did he slide it on. It was plain, a little loose. Florence looked down at it. We'll have Elmer's jeweler fix the size. It's fine. It'll fall off. Then we'll fix it. Miles smiled. Not the half smile, the whole thing. Florence had seen it perhaps twice. It changed his face enough that for a moment that she forgot what she meant to say. Miles noticed. You all right? No. His smile widened. Good. She laughed. Then he bent and kissed her. Nothing hurried. Nothing claimed. Just one careful kiss in a quiet kitchen while rainwater from the thaw dripped from the eaves outside. When they separated, Florence rested one hand briefly against his coat. Miles looked down at her. You sure? She nodded. Yes. That summer moved quickly. The old freight house became something else. Russell repaired the floor. Jerome painted the sign and complained that lettering was harder than fencing. Etta Marsh came first, a 38-year-old laundress from Millstone whose hands were red from years of lye soap and cold water. Florence hired her to help with bread and breakfast service. Lucille Boone came next. 29. 2 children. Quick with numbers and faster with a knife than Florence expected. She took over midday service within a month. The sign went up in June. Whitcomb and Corbett Mountain House. Florence stood beneath it with flour on her apron and looked until Jerome finally asked if he had spelled something wrong. No. She shook her head. It's right. Miles stood a few feet behind her. He said nothing. He did not need to. By August, freight teams stopped regularly. So did cattle buyers. Families traveling east learned that the rooms were clean and that Florence's bread came out of the oven before sunrise. No one asked whether she belonged in the front room. If they did not ask twice. Miles and Florence married quietly at Crosswind in early September. Russell stood with Miles. Nellie Brooks stood with Florence. Jerome cried harder than either of them and denied it afterward. A week later came Millstone's annual cattleman's supper. The same hall, the same long plank tables, the same swinging kitchen door. Florence arrived before dawn, not because Gordon Talbot had hired her, because the town committee had ordered bread and roast from Whitcomb and Corbett Mountain House. Etta and Lucille worked beside her. By evening, the hall was full. Florence stood at the rear table slicing bread when laughter rose from the dining room. For a moment, everything felt strangely familiar. The heat, the stove, the sound of plates, the partition. Then someone called from the front. Who made these rolls? Florence's knife stopped. On the other side of the door, conversation quieted. A year earlier, she would have waited. Waited for Gordon. Waited for one of the churchwomen. Waited for someone else to decide whether her name belonged in the room. She wiped her hands on her apron. Then she pushed open the door. The hall turned toward her. Gordon Talbot stood near the far wall. Nellie sat at one table. Russell and Jerome were together near the back, and Miles stood beside the window, impossible to miss in any room, his broad shoulders above nearly every other man there. He did not move toward her, did not introduce her, did not claim the moment. He simply watched. Florence stepped into the dining room. I did. Nothing dramatic happened. No applause, no sudden silence that belonged in a theater. A woman near the front smiled and asked whether Florence had more. A cattle buyer wanted to know where the mountain house was. Someone else asked if the apple pudding would be served next. Florence answered them, one by one, standing in the front room. Later, when the supper had thinned and the last lamps burned lower, Florence carried an empty bread basket back toward the kitchen. She stopped at the doorway. Her fingers rested against the frame. Miles came up beside her. Ready to ride home? Florence looked into the kitchen, then back across the hall. A year ago, this doorway had been where the world stopped seeing her. Now it was only a doorway, nothing more. She took Miles's hand. Now I am. They walked out together into the cool September night. The mountains stood dark beyond Millstone. Crosswind waited 12 miles north, and Florence did not walk behind him. She walked beside him. Maybe that is the part worth remembering. Imagine standing where Florence once stood, behind a kitchen door while other people received praise for the work your own hands had done. Imagine being judged before anyone bothered to know you, then carrying that hurt so long that making yourself smaller began to feel safer than hoping to be seen. Florence could have let those years decide what she was worth. She didn't. She kept cooking, kept counting every sack of flour, kept setting another plate on the table. And when Miles finally came into her life, he did not give her value. He simply recognized what had been there all along. Sometimes love arrives that way, quietly. Not as rescue, but as respect. Someone leaves room for you at the table, listens when you speak, and stands beside you without asking you to become smaller so they can feel larger. And sometimes a second chance isn't really about starting over. It's about finally having enough room to become the person you were trying to be all along. If you had been Florence, standing behind that kitchen door, would you have found the courage to walk through it? Tell me in the comments. I'd truly like to know. And if stories about overlooked people, hard-earned love, healing, and unexpected second chances mean something to you, you're welcome to subscribe and stay with us. There are many more stories waiting down the trail, some mysterious, some heartbreaking, and some that might just leave a little hope behind.